You don't belong here. Daniel's voice cut across the crowded ballroom like a blade. You never did. He was smiling when he said it, that old practiced smile that Claire Morgan had spent 3 years trying to forget. Her fingers tightened around her champagne glass. Beside her, Adrian Valenti said nothing. He simply looked at Daniel, and somehow that silence was the most terrifying thing in the room. If this story already has you hooked, subscribe to our channel right now and follow every twist until the very end. And drop a comment telling us what city you're watching from. I want to see just how far this story has traveled. Claire Morgan had not planned on seeing Daniel Whitmore tonight. She had planned on a quiet arrival, a brief appearance at the Valenti Foundation's annual charity gala, a few handshakes with the right people, and then a graceful exit before midnight. She had planned on wearing the navy dress hanging in her closet for 3 weeks, the one her assistant called elegant but understated. She had planned on steering through this evening the same way she navigated everything now, with precision, with intention, and with the kind of composure that came only from having survived something that should have destroyed you. What she had not planned on was Daniel standing 20 feet from the entrance with a glass of scotch in his hand and that particular expression on his face. The one that said he had already decided how the evening would go. The one she remembered from 100 dinners and 100 arguments and 100 moments when he'd looked at her like she was a problem he had to manage rather than a woman he was supposed to love. She saw him before he saw her. That gave her exactly 4 seconds of advantage. 4 seconds to breathe. 4 seconds to straighten. 4 seconds to make a decision about whether she was going to pretend she hadn't noticed him, or whether she was going to walk into this room with her chin up and her hand resting lightly in the crook of Adrian Valenti's arm, and let Daniel Whitmore see exactly what 3 years of rebuilding looked like. She chose to walk. Because Claire Morgan was not the woman Daniel left anymore, and she was finished letting anyone, including herself, forget that. Adrian felt the slight shift in her posture the moment she saw him. He was attuned to her in ways that surprised even him, a man who prided himself on reading rooms and people and situations before they became problems. He had learned Claire's silences over the past year. He had learned the difference between the silence that meant she was thinking and the silence that meant she was fighting something internally that she refused to let show on her face. This was the second kind. Someone you know, he said. It was not a question. My ex-husband, Claire said. Her voice was perfectly level. Don't react to him. Adrian looked at her sideways. I wasn't planning to. I know you weren't. I'm telling myself. That made him almost smile. They moved through the entrance together, and Claire felt the familiar weight of a room full of eyes. The Valenti Foundation Gala was not the kind of event where people arrived anonymously. Everyone in this ballroom had been watched, evaluated, and categorized the moment they crossed the threshold. Power operated in layers here, the openly wealthy, the quietly influential, and then the men and women whose names you only learned if they decided you were worth knowing. Adrian belonged to the third category. Claire had spent the last year learning to hold her own beside him without shrinking, and she had gotten better at it. Better at meeting the stares. Better at accepting the introductions without apologizing for being there. Better at understanding that her presence in this world was not dependent on his approval or anyone else's. She was still working on the believing it part. Daniel saw them when they were halfway across the room. She watched his expression move through its changes, the way weather moved across a flat field, fast, visible, impossible to stop. First came the recognition. Then came the confusion. Then came something she had not expected and did not know how to name immediately. It was not regret. It was recalibration. I was not looking at Claire and feeling sorry for what he had done. He was looking at Claire standing beside Adrian Valenti and doing rapid math, calculating what her presence in this room beside this particular man meant for the story Daniel had been telling about her for the past 3 years. The story where she was the unstable one, the difficult one, the one who never appreciated what she had. Claire recognized the moment he finished calculating, because his expression settled back into something familiar and deliberate. He picked up his scotch and he started moving toward them, and she felt something cold move through her chest. Not fear. She was done being afraid of Daniel. Something older than fear. The particular exhaustion of knowing that some people never stop coming back to cause damage, not because they want you back, but because they cannot stand watching you be fine without them. "Keep walking," she said quietly. Adrian said nothing. He kept pace with her unhurried. But Daniel was faster than she calculated, or the room was smaller than it felt, or perhaps it was simply the way certain people had a talent for cutting off your exits before you realized you needed one. He appeared at her left side, with the ease of a man who had spent decades making his presence feel inevitable. "Claire." He said her name the way he always had, like he owned it, like he had invented her. "This is unexpected." She stopped. Not because she wanted to, because stopping was better than letting him see her walk faster. "Daniel," she said. Just that. Just his name, flat and featureless, giving him nothing. He glanced at Adrian with the particular kind of look men like Daniel reserved for other men they were measuring. There was calculation in it, and something that wanted to be confidence, but landed closer to performance. "Adrian Valenti," Daniel said. "I've heard a great deal about you." Adrian looked at him. "I know," he said simply. Something flickered in Daniel's expression. He hadn't expected that answer. He'd expected the handshake, the pleasantries, the mutual acknowledgement of status that men at these events performed like a ritual. Adrian had given him none of that. He had simply looked at him and confirmed that Daniel's reputation had already arrived before he had, and that was all. Daniel recovered quickly. He was good at recovering quickly. 3 years of watching him recover from every moment he should have been accountable for had taught Claire exactly how fast the man could pivot. He turned back to her, and the smile returned. That smile. "You look well," he said. And then, because Daniel Whitmore could never simply say something without embedding a blade inside it, different, more polished. Claire met his eyes. "Thank you. I didn't mean it as a compliment." She heard someone nearby draw a small breath. Not loud. Just the faintest intake, the social recognition that something had just shifted in the room's weather. "I know," she said. Daniel's smile widened. He was warming up. She knew this rhythm. This was the beginning, the soft jabs designed to see how much she'd still tolerate, how quickly she'd become defensive, how fast he could get her back to being the version of herself that argued with him in their kitchen at 2 a.m. because she was desperate for him to understand something he had never had any intention of understanding. "So this is your new life," he said. He looked around the room. "Quite an upgrade from where you started." Adrian was still. Claire felt it, the quality of his stillness beside her. Not tension, not agitation. Something more contained than either of those things. Daniel glanced at him again. "I hope she told you about where she came from. I always admired that about Claire. She was very creative about her history." "Daniel." Claire's voice was quiet. "I'm just making conversation." "No," she said. "You are not." Something passed through his eyes. Satisfaction, maybe. Because this was what he wanted her, engaging her, reacting her, giving him the confirmation that she still had buttons he could press. He'd been pressing them for 6 years of marriage and had memorized the map. He leaned slightly forward. "I always wondered what would happen when you finally found someone rich enough to make the story work. Looks like you figured it out." Adrian set his glass down on the tray of a passing server. The sound was small, negligible, the quiet click of crystal against silver. But something about it moved through the nearby conversation like a frequency. People within earshot did not turn around. They simply became aware. Daniel's eyes moved to Adrian's face, and for the first time since he'd approached them, something in Daniel's expression changed in a way he had not controlled. He had walked into this conversation believing he had the advantage. He was the one who knew Claire. He was the one with 6 years of her insecurities, her history, the precise angles of her doubt. He was the one who had watched her cry in their kitchen and lose sleep over whether she was enough and question herself every time he'd made her feel like a liability instead of a partner. He had that knowledge, and he had assumed it was power. He had not yet understood something critical about the man standing beside her. Adrian Valenti did not need 6 years of someone's history to see them clearly. He had been reading people since before most men. at this event understood what they were, and what he read in Daniel Whitmore in the first 40 seconds of this conversation was not a man who was confident. It was a man who needed Claire to be diminished in front of witnesses, because her success, her obvious, visible, undeniable success, was a mirror he could not look into without flinching. Adrian had met 100 men like Daniel. Men who only felt powerful when they were standing on someone else. The difference was that most of those men had learned eventually to do it more quietly. Daniel apparently had not. "You seem," Adrian said, and his voice was the same register as the room, perfectly conversational. Nothing elevated, nothing projected, like a man who has spent a great deal of time being disappointed. The nearby conversation dropped another degree. Daniel turned to him. "Excuse me." "It's an observation," Adrian said, "not a criticism." "I don't think I asked for your observations." "No," Adrian agreed. "You asked for an audience. There's a difference." The color in Daniel's face changed. It was subtle, the kind of thing you only caught if you were watching for it, and several people in the immediate vicinity were now watching for it. Daniel laughed. The kind of laugh that wants to be easy and comes out a half-second too late. "Claire always did have a type," he said. "Men who think they're more interesting than they are." Adrian looked at him. The look was mild and completely unhurried, and somehow worse than anything angry would have been. "She built something real after you," Adrian said. "On her own, without asking anyone's permission. I imagine that must be frustrating to watch." "She didn't build anything," Daniel said. The control in his voice slipped just slightly. "She took what was already there and put her name on it." Claire went very still. Not the stillness of defeat. The stillness of someone who has just heard a lie said out loud that they thought they would never have to hear again. Because this was what Daniel had always done, not just to her, but about her. To their shared friends. To the colleagues who asked what had happened to the marriage. He had spent 3 years constructing a version of Claire, in which everything she achieved was derivative, borrowed, or stolen from foundations he claimed to have laid. And the worst of it, the part that had eaten at her for 3 years, was that there had been moments when she half believed him. When the company had its first bad quarter, she had heard his voice in her head. When a partnership fell through, she had heard it again. Not loud, just persistent. The way water gets into a wall, quiet and constant, until the whole structure is compromised. She was so tired of that voice. "Daniel." Her own voice surprised her. Steady, quiet, not shaking the way it used to. He looked at her. "You should stop," she said. He smiled. "Why am I making you uncomfortable?" "No," she said. "I'm trying to give you an exit." Something moved through his face. Confusion, then irritation, then the particular expression of a man who has realized the conversation has moved in a direction he didn't plan for. "You're giving me an exit," he repeated. "Yes, that's interesting." His eyes moved between her and Adrian. "Last time I checked, you were the one who needed exits. You were the one who couldn't function without someone managing things for you." "That was your word, Claire. You said it yourself. You needed someone to help you function." The room was listening now. Not conspicuously, not the theatrical turning of heads that made a scene. But the density of attention around them had increased, and Claire felt it the way you feel a drop in pressure before a storm. This was the thing about Daniel's public humiliations. He was good at them. He knew exactly how to calibrate his cruelty so that it looked like candor, like a man simply being honest. Sharing a memory, having a conversation, while the actual effect was excavation. He was digging out the version of her she had tried to bury and displaying it to witnesses. And the worst part was not that he was lying. The worst part was that he was using something true. She had said that. 3 years into their marriage, in a moment of complete exhaustion after a week where everything had gone wrong. At once, she had looked at Daniel across their dining room table and said the most honest thing she had said in months. She had said she needed help functioning. She had said it because she thought honesty might move him. She had said it because she trusted him with her worst moment. He had stored it. She should have known better. She did know better now. But knowing better now did not erase the fact that she had once handed him that particular knife, and he had been patient enough to wait for the right audience to use it. Adrian turned to look at her. not to check on her, not with the expression of a man worried she was about to fall apart. He looked at her, the way he always looked at her, like he was certain she was going to handle this, and he was simply present. And if she wanted him to step in, she would tell him, and if she didn't, he would stand here and be exactly what she needed without her having to ask. And something about that look did more for her than any intervention would have, because Daniel had spent 6 years making her feel like a variable he had to manage. Adrian had spent 1 year making her feel like a person worth standing beside. The difference between those two things was so large and so clear that standing here in this room between them, she could feel it in her sternum, the distance between who she had been and who she had become, and the furious, quiet certainty that she was never going back. She looked back at Daniel. "You're right," she said. "I said that. I was exhausted, and I was in pain, and I trusted you with something real, and you kept it. You kept it like a receipt." Daniel's expression did not change, but something behind his eyes shifted. "I'm not ashamed of that moment," she continued. "What I said was true. What I was living was hard. But here's what's also true, Daniel. Every person in this room has had a moment like that. Every person here has said something in a low moment that someone could use against them. The question is, what kind of person takes that and brings it out in public 3 years later to perform with?" Silence. Not the polite, managed quiet of a crowd carefully pretending not to listen. The real kind. The kind where people stop tracking their own conversations because what's happening 12 feet away has gravity. Daniel's jaw tightened. "I'm not performing anything." "Then what would you call this?" Claire asked. She was not angry. That was the thing she could feel, that she was not angry, and the absence of anger surprised her because she had expected to be furious by now. Instead, she felt something she could not immediately name, something clean, like the aftermath of a fever breaking. "You walked over here to do this. You've been building up to it since we walked through the door. You're good at it, you always were. But I'm asking you sincerely, what is it you're hoping to get?" Silence from Daniel. 3 seconds of it. 4. Adrian stood absolutely still. "Because I'm not angry with you," Claire said. "I want you to know that. I spent a long time being angry. I'm finished with it. I don't need you to admit anything or apologize for anything or change anything. I just want to know, when you came over here, what were you hoping for?" The silence stretched one beat further than was comfortable. And then Daniel said something none of them expected. "I wanted you to look scared." The words landed like something falling, not said loudly, almost confessed, the kind of thing that comes out when a man has been so focused on his performance that he loses track of his script. He wanted her to look scared. He had crossed this room and approached her in front of witnesses and built his small cruelties with care, and all of it, every word, every smile, every excavated wound, had been in service of that one goal. I wanted to see in her face the thing he remembered. The woman who flinched. The woman who got small. The woman who proved that he still had the power to make her feel like nothing. And she had not given it to him. Claire looked at him. And when she spoke, her voice was the gentlest it had been all evening. "I know," she said. "I could see that. That's why I'm telling you I'm not scared. And I don't think you were ever as interested in destroying me as you were in proving I couldn't survive without you." She paused. "But I did. I survived. I built something, and you have spent 3 years watching it happen." She held his gaze one moment longer. "I think that's much harder for you than anything that ever happened to me." Daniel said nothing. He had no script for this. For 6 years, he had written the scenes and assigned the roles, and Claire had played the part he gave her, sometimes with resistance, but always eventually with compliance. She was not complying now. She was not even fighting. She was just standing there looking at him with the steady, unhurried eyes of a woman who had already won something he could not name and could not take, and he had nothing to put against it. Adrian reached into his jacket. He removed a folded envelope and set it on the table between them, with the same unhurried calm with which he'd set down his glass. He did not explain it. He did not gesture toward it. He simply set it there. "That has your attention," Daniel said. He was trying to regain footing. "What is this?" Adrian looked at him. "Something you should have expected years ago," he said. "But you'll understand it better when you're somewhere quiet." He turned to Claire. "Ready," he said. She looked at the envelope. She looked at Daniel's face, the confusion there, the first real fracture of his composure, and she felt something she had not expected to feel in this room on this evening, in this encounter with the man who had once made her believe she was less. She felt finished. Not triumphant, not vindicated, not burning with righteous anger, just finished. The way you feel when you finally put down something you've been carrying too long, and your arms stop aching, and you realize the weight was never yours to carry in the first place. "Yes," she said. "I'm ready." They walked away. Behind them, Daniel stood with the envelope on the table and a room full of the most influential people in New York, quietly cataloging everything they had just witnessed. He reached for the envelope. His hands were not entirely steady, and the man who had walked across this ballroom to watch Claire Morgan flinch stood alone in the middle of a crowd, finally beginning to understand that he had badly miscalculated the kind of woman she had become, and the kind of man standing beside her. Daniel Whitmore did not open the envelope that night. He told himself it was because he was not the kind of man who let other men dictate his pace. He told himself he would look at it on his own terms in his own time, and that whatever Adrian Valenti thought he had put inside that envelope was not going to change anything about how Daniel operated, or what Daniel knew, or who Daniel was in this city. He told himself all of that in the car home, and again in the elevator up to his penthouse, and one more time standing in his kitchen with a glass of scotch he didn't taste. Then he opened it, and the first thing he felt was not anger. It was recognition, because everything in that envelope, every document, every printout, every page of financial records dated and cross-referenced and annotated in a hand that was not Adrian's, but clearly belonged to someone Adrian trusted, was information that Daniel had spent 3 years believing was buried. Information he had gone to considerable expense and effort to make disappear. Information that by every calculation he had made should not have been recoverable by anyone operating within the bounds of what was legal. He sat down slowly. He read for a long time, and when he was finished, he poured the scotch down the drain because suddenly the idea of anything blurring his thinking felt dangerous. What Daniel did not know, what most people at that gala did not know, and what Claire herself was only beginning to understand, was how long Adrian Valenti had been watching. Not watching Claire. He had not entered her life with a dossier and a plan. That was not how Adrian operated, and it was not who he was, despite what the rumors said about him, and despite the particular mythology that collected around men with his kind of power. What Adrian had been watching was Daniel. It had started 8 months before he ever met Claire, 14 months before the gala, before the dinner where a mutual acquaintance had introduced them, and Adrian had spent 20 minutes talking to a woman who disagreed with him twice in the first 5 minutes and did not apologize for either of them. 14 months before he had driven home from that dinner thinking about her in a way that was inconvenient and interesting in equal measure. 8 months before all of that, one of Adrian's attorneys had flagged a series of transactions connected to a mid-sized financial consulting firm that overlapped with one of Adrian's holding companies. The overlap was minor. The transactions were the kind of thing that most people would have looked at and dismissed as coincidental and slightly sloppy, but not deliberately harmful. Adrian was not most people. He had asked his people to look deeper. What they found 3 weeks later was a pattern, not a crime, not yet, or at least not provably, but a pattern of financial behavior that had the signature of someone who was very good at making their accountability invisible. Someone who knew exactly where to put things so they would not be found by a cursory examination. Someone who had built a system of small deceptions layered so carefully on top of each other that you had to know what you were looking for before any of it resolved into a coherent picture. His financial team had traced that pattern back to a company. The company traced back to a man. Daniel Whitmore. Adrian had filed it. He had noted it. He had kept a copy of everything his team compiled, and he had moved on because at that point, Daniel Whitmore was simply a name attached to a problem that had already been corrected, and Adrian had larger concerns. He had not thought about Daniel Whitmore again for 6 months. Until the night he had dinner with Claire. She had not told him about her marriage on that first evening. She had not told him about it on the second or the third or the fourth, which was technically not a date, but had lasted 4 hours over coffee that went cold, and neither of them acknowledged. She was not secretive about it exactly. She simply did not lead with it, and Adrian understood instinctively that this was not avoidance, but self-preservation. She was not hiding her history. She was protecting the new version of herself from being reduced to it. He respected that immediately. He respected it the way he respected the way she shook her head when he offered to handle a problem she was working through. Not ungratefully, but with the specific composure of someone who had learned the hard way that accepting certain kinds of help came with costs that outlasted the help itself. He learned her history in pieces, not because she withheld it, but because she told it the way it actually lived inside her, not in one clean narrative with a beginning and an end, but in fragments that surfaced in context. A comment about a business decision she'd made 2 years ago that hadn't gone the way she'd hoped. A moment where she'd mentioned briefly that the company's early financing had been complicated in ways she still didn't fully understand. A quiet evening where she'd said without any particular weight that she'd spent a long time not trusting her own judgment, and she was still working on undoing that. He had listened. And 3 weeks after that last conversation, he had gone back to the file his team had compiled on Daniel Whitmore. He had read it again. This time, he had read it with a different understanding, and what had previously looked like a pattern of financial carelessness resolved with this new context into something much more specific. It was not carelessness, it was targeting. "I need you to pull everything on the Whitmore transactions," he had told Marcus, the man who had run Adrian's financial intelligence for 11 years, and who had the particular quality of someone who could spend a week looking at numbers without sleeping and emerge from it calm and precise. Everything from the beginning, and cross-reference it with anything connected to a company called Morgan Consulting. Marcus had looked at him with the expression of a man who had learned not to ask certain questions. "How deep?" he'd asked. "All the way," Adrian had said. What Marcus brought back 10 days later was not what Adrian had expected. He had expected to find what he'd suspected, that Daniel had taken money from Claire. Drained accounts, leveraged her name for credit she didn't know about. That kind of behavior was not uncommon in the profile of a man like Daniel, and it was damaging and wrong and worth knowing about, but it was the kind of thing Adrian had seen variations of before. What Marcus had actually found was something more systematic than theft. It was erasure. Daniel had not simply taken from Claire. He had spent the duration of their marriage carefully constructing a financial reality in which Claire appeared to be a liability. Loans taken in her name for investments she had never known about. Credit lines opened under her signature, a signature that legal documents would later show had been replicated with a precision that was not accidental. Accounts that looked from the outside like Claire's professional failures, but which had on examination been set up to fail from the beginning. He had created a version of her professional life designed to make her look incompetent. And then he had left, and walked away into a narrative where Claire Morgan was the problem in the marriage. The unstable one. The one who couldn't manage money or manage herself or manage anything beyond the carefully curated image she was projecting to cover for the mess underneath. The mess he had built. Marcus had set the final summary document on the desk and said nothing for a moment. Then he had said, "This is the kind of work that takes planning. This isn't reactive. He built this over years." Adrian had looked at the document for a long time. "How solid is it?" he'd asked. "Solid enough that a good attorney could file on it tomorrow," Marcus said. "Solid enough that any court looking at this with fresh eyes is going to have a very difficult time arriving at the conclusion that she was incompetent." And what conclusion will they arrive at? Marcus had met his eyes. That she was set up. Adrian had not told Claire. This was the decision that had cost him the most sleep in the month since Marcus had delivered that report. He had wrestled with it genuinely, uncomfortably wrestled with it, because he understood that the information belonged to her in a way it could never belong to him. It was her history, her name on those documents, her reputation that had been the target. But he had also understood something about Claire that made him careful. She was in the process of rebuilding something fragile and real and deeply personal. Not her business. Her business was doing fine, better than fine, and she had built it through her own intelligence and persistence, and the particular quality she had of making people trust her before she ever asked them to. What she was rebuilding was her belief in herself. The quiet, private certainty that her perception of reality was accurate. That what she saw was actually what was there. That she was not, as Daniel had spent years implying, fundamentally unreliable. If Adrian had gone to her with this file, he would have been giving her the truth. But he would also have been giving her another version of the same thing Daniel had always done. A man arriving with information about her own life that she hadn't found herself telling her what her history really meant, and positioning himself as the one who finally understood when everyone else had missed it. She needed to trust herself. She did not need another man telling her what to believe. So he had kept the file. He had kept it for 6 months. And he had waited for the moment when it mattered in a way that could not be avoided, the moment when the lie was being performed publicly, in front of witnesses, in a way that left Claire no option except to absorb it or fight it without the tools to fight it properly. He had not planned for that moment to be the gala. He had carried the envelope because Marcus had called him 2 days earlier to tell him that Daniel was going to be at the event, a detail that came from the kind of network Adrian maintained that made information like that simply available. And Adrian had made a quiet decision. Not a dramatic one, not a planned confrontation, just a contingency. If Daniel left Claire alone, the envelope stayed in his pocket. Daniel had not left her alone. The morning after the gala, Claire called him. Not the way she usually called, which was practical. Direct, a voice that covered the ground it needed to cover and didn't wander. She called him, and he could hear before she said a word that she had not slept, and that the sleeplessness was not the anxious kind, but the processing kind. The hours spent lying in the dark and turning something over and over until it wore smooth. "The envelope," she said. "Yes." "You knew, before last night." It was not a question. She had had the whole night to put together the timeline, the specificity of the documents, the depth of what had been compiled, the way it had appeared not as a sudden discovery, but as something retrieved from where it had been waiting. "Yes," he said again. A pause. "How long?" 6 months. Another pause. Longer. He waited. He was good at waiting. "Why didn't you tell me?" And this was the question he had been preparing for since the night Marcus laid the summary document on his desk, and he still found when it arrived that his answer was less polished than he'd expected. Because the real answer was not strategic. It was not about protecting her or managing the information or any of the clean, defensible reasons he'd told himself at 2 in the morning. The real answer was that he had fallen in love with a woman who had spent 6 years being told she couldn't see clearly, and he had been terrified of becoming another voice telling her what to see. "Because it was yours," he said. "The truth about your own life belongs to you. I wasn't going to hand it to you like I'd figured out something you missed." Silence. He could not read this silence. That was rare for him, rare enough that it made him pay closer attention to his own breathing, which was not as steady as he preferred. "That might be," Claire said slowly, "the most complicated thing anyone has ever done for me out of respect." "Is that a good thing?" "I'm still deciding." He almost smiled. "That's fair." "Adrian." Her voice changed slightly. The processing quality left it, and something more direct came in underneath. "What's in those documents? All of it? Is it as bad as I think it is after reading them?" He considered his answer. Not to soften it. Claire did not need softening, and she had made clear across the months he'd known her that what she needed from him was accuracy, not management. But because precision mattered here. "It's worse," he said. "What you've read is the summary. The full picture is worse." A very long pause. "He built it," she said. "He built all of it on purpose. It wasn't sloppiness. It wasn't recklessness. No. He sat across from me at dinner and watched me blame myself for things he had engineered." Her voice was still controlled, but there was something underneath the control now. Something that was not quite anger and not quite grief, and was maybe the particular feeling of having a piece of yourself returned that you'd stopped looking for because you'd accepted it as simply gone. "He watched me fall apart over my own failure at a company that was set up to look like my failure." "Yes," Adrian said. "I need a minute." "Take whatever you need." He heard her breathe. Once. Twice. Then, "What do you want to do with this?" What do you want to do with it? He said. It's yours. Another pause. And then quietly, and with a steadiness that hit him somewhere he hadn't expected, she said, I want justice. I want the actual truth on record somewhere permanent. I want it documented that what looked like my failure was someone else's deliberate construction. She paused. But I don't want it to be about him. I don't want the story of the next 10 years of my life to be about what Daniel did. Those don't have to be the same thing, Adrian said. I know. He heard something shift in her voice. That's why I'm talking to you. What happened next did not happen in a single conversation or a single day or a single dramatic confrontation in anyone's office. It happened the way real things happen, slowly, and with paperwork, and with the particular grinding patience required by any process designed to produce a documented truth from what had previously been a covered lie. Adrian's attorney, a woman named Elaine Cho, who had been practicing financial law for 22 years, and who had a reputation for being the person you called when you needed something ironclad rather than fast, had reviewed the full file within 48 hours of the gala. She had called Adrian on the third day, with a voice that told him before she said anything substantive that what she had found was enough. Enough for what? He had asked. Enough for everything she wants, Elaine had said. Enough to challenge the original divorce settlement, which she should never have agreed to, but presumably signed because she had no idea what she was actually signing away. Enough to demonstrate to any court or regulatory body that the financial picture presented during that marriage was constructed rather than organic. Enough, frankly, to end his career in this city, if that's the direction she chooses to take it. Adrian had relayed this to Claire, not in a phone call, but over dinner. A dinner that was not a date in the way their early dinners had been careful not to be, but which was also unmistakably something else. Something that had been building for a year, and that neither of them felt the need to name precisely because naming it would have made it smaller than it was. She had listened to everything he said without interrupting. Then she had said, I don't want his career. I know. I want my name back, in the record. I want a document that exists somewhere in the world that says clearly what happened. That's achievable. She had looked at him across the table. And after that? After that, he had said, you decide what your life looks like, without that weight. She had held his gaze for a moment. You've been carrying this for 6 months, she said. Yes. That must have been difficult, knowing something that belonged to someone else. He considered that. It was, he said, but the alternative was worse. The alternative being, becoming someone who decided what you needed to know about your own life. She was quiet. Then, Daniel used to do that. He used to decide what I needed to know. He called it protecting me. I know. You know, she said. You know everything apparently. There was no bitterness in it. She was not accusing him. She was locating something. What do you not know? I thought about it seriously because she was asking seriously. What you're going to do next, he said. After all of this settles, what you want. Not the company, not the legal resolution. What you actually want for yourself past all of this. She looked at him, and for the first time in the conversation, maybe for the first time in a long time, something in her face that had been held carefully in place simply released. Not dramatically. Not with tears or confession, or any of the things that a certain kind of storytelling would require in this moment. Just a small, quiet dropping of the armor. I want to stop waiting for the next thing to collapse, she said. I want to build something and believe it's mine, completely, without the part of my brain that keeps waiting for it to be taken. He looked at her for a long moment. That part of your brain, he said carefully, isn't wrong for existing. It learned something real. You're not going to think it out of yourself. You're going to have to prove it wrong by living past it. I know, she said. And you're already doing that. She looked at him. How do you know? He held her gaze. Because the woman Daniel described last night doesn't exist anymore. Maybe she never did. He paused. He was describing someone he needed you to be. And last night in that room you showed him and everyone else exactly who you actually are. She was very still. I was terrified, she said quietly. For about 30 seconds after he walked over, I was completely terrified. I know. Could you tell? Yes, he said. And then you stopped being terrified, and you were just there, present, and you handled it. She looked at the table for a moment. You could have stepped in earlier, she said, before I said any of that. Yes. Why didn't you? He held her gaze. Because you didn't need me to. The silence that followed was the kind that had texture, not empty, but full of everything neither of them had said yet. All the things that had been building across months of dinners that lasted too long, and conversations that went places neither of them had planned, and the particular slow accumulation of trust between two people who had both learned at cost that trust was worth being careful with. Claire picked up her glass. She held it for a moment. The envelope, she said, putting it on the table like that in that room in front of all those people. Yes. You knew he wasn't going to open it there. Yes. So what was the point of it? Adrian leaned back slightly, and when he answered his voice carried the quiet, unhurried certainty of a man who had thought about this carefully. The point, he said, was that he knew it existed, that somewhere someone had assembled the truth about what he did, and that he was going to have to spend the rest of that evening and every evening after not knowing what was coming next. Claire looked at him. That's cold, she said. Yes. She considered that. He made me feel that way for 6 years, she said. Like I never knew what was coming next. Like the ground was always slightly unsteady. I know. She set her glass down. I'm not going to pretend I'm sorry for him, she said. I know I should probably. You don't have to pretend anything with me, Adrian said simply. She looked at him. Something shifted between them. Something that had been shifting for months. That slow continental movement of two people who had been orbiting each other and were now closer than either of them had planned on getting, and neither of them was stepping back from. This is going to be complicated, she said. He held her gaze. Most things worth doing are. She studied him for a moment. The way she studied things quietly with the intelligence she'd spent years apologizing for to a man who'd found her perceptiveness inconvenient. You knew that file would be a problem, she said. When you didn't tell me. You knew there was a version of this where I found out you'd been sitting on it and I was furious. Yes. And you made that choice anyway. Yes. Why? He was quiet for a moment, not hesitating, locating the truth of it with the care it deserved. Because the right thing and the safe thing are not always the same thing, he said. And I learned a long time ago that choosing safety over right is how people stop respecting themselves. She held that. I'm not furious, she said finally. I know. I might have been, in a different version of this. I know that too. She looked at him. This man who had walked into her life sideways, who had never once told her what she needed to be, who had carried a truth that belonged to her for 6 months without using it as leverage or currency, or a way to make her need him more. Daniel thought I needed someone powerful to protect me, she said slowly. I know. And you? She stopped, started again. You never acted like that. Because it was never true, Adrian said. You needed someone who wasn't in the way. He paused. That's a different thing. The evening had grown quiet around them by then. And in that quiet, something settled, not dramatically, not with the weight of announcement, but with the ease of something finding the place it had always been meant to be. Somewhere across the city, in a penthouse that felt considerably less secure than it had 24 hours ago. Daniel Whitmore was reading the same documents for the 3rd time, looking for the piece he had missed, the gap, the error, the place where the record was incomplete enough to give him room. He was not finding it, because Adrian's people did not leave gaps. And the truth, once it had been assembled this carefully, did not offer the kind of room that Daniel Whitmore had built his entire life on finding. Elaine Cho had been practicing financial law for 22 years, and she had learned over those years to keep her voice professionally neutral, regardless of what she was looking at. She did not manage it when she called Adrian on the 4th morning after the gala. I need to tell you something, she said, and there was an edge in her voice that Adrian recognized immediately. Not alarm exactly, but the particular sharpening that happened when a person who processed information for a living encountered something that had surprised them past their usual equilibrium. "Tell me," he said. "The documents your team compiled, I've been working through the full package, not just the summary, and there's a layer in here that wasn't in the initial report." She paused. "The loans taken in Claire's name. I thought we were dealing with 3, maybe 4 accounts." "We are. Adrian, there are 11. The line was quiet for a moment. "Say that again," he said. 11 separate credit lines or loan instruments opened under Claire Morgan's signature or tax identification number during the course of the marriage, spanning 7 years. The earliest predates the wedding by 4 months. Another pause. He started before the ring was on her finger. Adrian did not say anything for a long moment. He was not a man who required time to process information. He processed fast. It was one of the things that had kept him alive and solvent, and several steps ahead of people who wanted to be where he was. But this particular piece of information required a different kind of processing. Not logistical, something older. 4 months before the wedding, Daniel Whitmore had stood in front of Claire Morgan and made promises in front of her family and whatever friends she had then. And 4 months before that moment, he had already begun building the architecture of her financial destruction. "What's the total exposure?" Adrian asked. Elaine told him. He absorbed the number. "She doesn't know," he said. "She couldn't have. 3 of those accounts were set up with a secondary address, not her home address, the apartment she'd had before the marriage. All correspondence would have gone to a location she no longer had access to. He would have intercepted anything that came to the house." Elaine's voice was controlled but tight. "This is not a man who made a series of bad decisions. This is premeditated. This is a plan that was executed over years." "Yes," Adrian said. "The question is what Claire wants to do with it." "I'll talk to her." "Adrian." Elaine paused. "Prepare her. What she's been carrying, the belief that she failed, that she was professionally inadequate, that her early stumbles were evidence of something lacking in her, every piece of that came from this. He built a financial reality designed to make her look like the problem. And he did it before they were married." A brief silence. "I've seen a lot of things in 22 years. This is meticulous. This is the kind of thing someone does when they've decided at a foundational level that another person exists to be used. I understand." "Does she?" "Not yet," Adrian said. "But she will." He went to her office that afternoon. He did not call first, not because he wanted to catch her off guard, but because he understood that some conversations needed to happen in person in real time, where he could watch her face and she could watch his, and nothing could be softened by the distance a phone created. Her assistant, a young woman named Priya, who was fiercely protective of Claire's schedule and had looked at Adrian with polite suspicion the first 3 times he'd come by before deciding he was probably acceptable, let him in without buzzing Claire first. Which told him something about how well he'd apparently passed whatever evaluation Priya had been running. Claire was at her desk. She was on a call, and she held up one finger when she saw him, the universal signal that said she saw him, and she needed 90 seconds, and he sat in the chair across from her desk and waited. He watched her work. She was in the middle of what sounded like a negotiation. Calm, precise, not giving ground where ground did not need to be given. She said something that made the person on the other end of the line recalibrate. He could tell from the brief silence that followed before the other voice resumed at a slightly different register. She had a quality in professional settings that she sometimes underestimated in herself, a particular steadiness that made people trust her before they entirely understood why. She ended the call, set the phone down, looked at him. "You have your serious face on," she said. "Elaine called me this morning." Claire's expression shifted. She became very still in the way she had learned to be still, not closed off, but present. Taking in what was coming rather than bracing against it. "Tell me," she said. He told her. He watched her face move through a sequence of things as he talked. The initial tightening around her eyes when he said 11. The small movement in her jaw when he explained the timeline. The moment precise and visible when he said 4 months before the wedding, and something in her face simply stopped moving altogether for 3 full seconds. and then she breathed. 4 months, she said. Yes. I thought... She stopped. Started again. I thought the earliest transaction was 3 months after the wedding. That was the date on the document I saw. That was the first domestic account. There was an earlier one set up under your tax ID through a shell structure that used your pre-marriage address. He would have received all correspondence. She was looking at the desk. Not at anything on the desk, just at the surface of it. I spent, she said slowly, the first year after the divorce going over everything I had done wrong. Every decision, every investment that went badly, every account that was overextended. She paused. I made a list, an actual written list, of my failures. Adrian said nothing. And I worked through it. I found a therapist. I did the work. I accepted responsibility. She looked up. I accepted responsibility for things I did not do. Her voice was steady. He marveled at it, the steadiness of her even now, even receiving this. And then he understood again that the steadiness was not the absence of feeling. It was the result of having learned to feel without being destroyed by it. She had been in that particular training program for years, and she was whatever it had cost her proficient. The list, he said carefully. The things on it. I can take it apart now, I assume. She held his gaze. I can look at every item and find it in those documents. Probably most of them, he said. Not all you made decisions of your own. Some of them worked out, some didn't. You're not without the ordinary mistakes anyone makes in business. But the ones that wrecked you, the ones that made you believe you were fundamentally unsuited for what you'd built, those weren't yours. She closed her eyes. Not for long. 5 seconds. When she opened them, there was something in them that was not quite anger. It was past anger. It was the specific clarifying emotion that comes when you have been in a fog for a very long time, and someone finally opens a window and the light is welcome, but it also shows you everything. The darkness had been hiding, and the inventory of what you're looking at is not comfortable. What does Elaine recommend? She said. She recommends filing to reopen the divorce settlement. The original terms were negotiated on a fraudulent financial basis. Claire's reported assets were understated, and her reported liabilities were inflated, both by instruments she had no knowledge of. Any court looking at this will see the settlement as void. He paused. And separately, there are the regulatory questions. Meaning, 11 instruments opened under forged or manipulated documentation. Some of them involve institutional lenders. Elaine says at least 3 of those lenders have reporting obligations that once they're aware of the fraud, they may be required to fulfill, regardless of what you decide to pursue personally. Claire absorbed this. So it might not be entirely in my hands, she said. Some of it may not be, no. And Daniel knows this. He knows what was in the envelope. He doesn't know what Elaine found in the deeper review. She looked at him. He's going to try to get ahead of it, she said. It was not a question. And Adrian registered not for the first time that this woman understood how people operated in ways she consistently underestimated in herself. She had been married to a man who ran information like a weapon, and she had absorbed, whether she knew it or not, an education in how that worked. Yes, he said. He'll call an attorney today if he hasn't already. He'll start looking for leverage angles where the record is ambiguous enough to argue over. He's done this before. He knows how to make a clean story murky. Can he succeed? Adrian held her gaze. Not with what we have, he said. Daniel's attorney, a man named Price, who had the particular confidence of someone who had won too many cases he should have lost, called Elaine Cho at 9 the following morning. Elaine relayed the conversation to Adrian that afternoon. He's claiming the transactions were joint decisions that Claire was aware of and consented to. He's framing the documentation as tax planning, not fraud. He says he has correspondence, emails, text messages supporting his version of events. She paused. He was very smooth about it. And, Adrian said, and I told him I looked forward to reviewing that correspondence in discovery. Another pause. I was somewhat less smooth after that. Can he produce what he's claiming? Some of it probably. Daniel isn't stupid, he would have built cover as he went. There will be emails that could be read as Claire being informed about financial decisions. They won't say what he claims they say, but they'll exist, and a less experienced attorney on the other side might spend considerable time and money sorting through them. Elaine's voice held the controlled satisfaction of a person who has seen this particular gambit before and knows exactly how to answer it. I am not a less experienced attorney. No, Adrian agreed. There's something else, Elaine said. Price mentioned somewhat obliquely that his client has information relevant to one of your holding companies. He didn't specify. He let it sit there. Adrian was quiet for a moment. A threat, he said. A suggestion, very politely delivered. What holding company? He didn't say. I think that was intentional. He wanted you to spend time wondering which one. Adrian considered this. It was a move he recognized. When the direct attack was failing, create peripheral uncertainty, make the other side spend energy auditing their own position instead of pressing forward. It was not unsophisticated. It also told him something important. Daniel was not handling this with the confidence of a man who had strong cards. He was handling it with the particular creativity of someone who was trying to generate leverage from nothing, which meant the documents were as solid as Elaine had said, and Daniel knew it. Tell Price, Adrian said, that I look forward to any information his client wants to bring forward regarding my business interests, and that my financial records are available for review by any authorized body at any time. He paused. Tell him that carefully. Elaine understood what that meant. A man with nothing to hide did not need to be careful about inviting scrutiny. A man who was inviting scrutiny, openly, calmly, with the suggestion that he had been expecting this possibility and had made preparations accordingly, was a man communicating something very specific about the relative positions of the two parties. That'll land, Elaine said. Yes, Adrian said. It will. Claire did not find out about Price's call until the following evening, when she came to Adrian's apartment for dinner, and found him at the kitchen counter with 2 phones and a legal pad covered in his handwriting. And she looked at the legal pad and looked at him and said, "What happened?" He told her. All of it. Price's call, the implied threat, his response through Elaine. She listened without interrupting, and when he finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "He threatened you." He gestured toward a threat. There's a difference. He used you to try to get to me. Her voice was flat. Not cold, something past cold. The particular temperature of someone who has just crossed a line in their own internal landscape. He couldn't get to me directly, so he used you as leverage. He tried, Adrian said. It won't work. That's not the point. She looked at him. The point is that he pulled you into this. He made you collateral. She shook her head slightly. That's what he does. He doesn't fight the person he's actually angry at. He attacks the thing they value most and waits for them to protect it. Adrian looked at her. You know him very well, he said. I lived with him for 6 years. She sat down. I used to think that was a failure, that I had spent 6 years studying someone who turned out to be using me the whole time. But knowing how he operates is the only thing that's going to get us through this without him turning it into a 5-year legal nightmare. Tell me what he'll do next, Adrian said. She looked at him across the kitchen counter. I was asking her seriously. Not as a test, not as a demonstration of anything. He was asking because she knew the answer, and he didn't, and he was fully capable of simply acknowledging that and asking. She had been waiting without knowing it for someone to ask her things that way for a very long time. He'll stall, she said. He'll generate as much paperwork and ambiguity as possible, because delay is his friend. The longer this takes, the more it costs me, and he knows my resources better than anyone. He'll challenge the authenticity of every document. He'll claim I was a full partner in every decision. And at some point he'll find one person, a mutual acquaintance, a former colleague, someone who owes him something, and he'll use them to put a different version of the story into the world. A public story, Adrian said. He's very good at public stories. She folded her hands on the counter. He told one about me for 3 years, and enough people believed it that I had to work twice as hard for every professional opportunity, because someone always already had a version of me that wasn't true. She held Adrian's gaze. The documents are solid, but documents live in legal proceedings. He's going to fight in public where the documents don't reach. Adrian was quiet for a moment. What would stop that, he said. Someone who knows the real story going public first. She paused. Not me. Me going public looks defensive. It looks like someone trying to control the narrative before someone else does. Then who? She looked at him. And he saw it the moment the idea arrived in her mind, because she had the quality of someone whose thinking was visible in her eyes, if you knew how to read them, and he had spent a year learning. The people at the gala, she said slowly. Everyone in that room saw something. They saw what Daniel did and how he did it. Some of those people... She stopped. Some of those people know other things about Daniel that he has no idea they know, because he never paid attention to who was in the room when he thought he was being private. Adrian waited. There's a woman, Claire said. Her name is Judith Harmon. She's been running her family's investment firm for 30 years. She was at the gala. And she was also at a dinner 7 years ago before Daniel and I were married, where Daniel said something about her that he would not want documented. She met Adrian's eyes. He said it in front of 3 people. One of them told me later. I never said anything because I thought we were married, and you didn't do that to your spouse's professional network. What did he say about her? He said she had gotten where she was because her father was too senile to stop her, and the board was too afraid of the optics to replace her. She paused. Judith Harmon took her father's firm from $40 million in assets under management to $300 million in 12 years. She is one of the most capable people in this city, and Daniel said that about her to people he trusted to stay quiet. Adrian looked at her. Did they stay quiet? I don't know, Claire said. But I know Judith was at the gala, and I know she saw everything, and I know she gave me her card on the way out. She reached into her bag. The card was there. She set it on the counter between them. Adrian looked at it. Call her, he said. Judith Harmon picked up on the second ring, which told Claire 2 things: that Judith had seen her name on the screen and chosen to answer, and that the answer had been deliberate rather than automatic. Claire Morgan, Judith said. Her voice was precise and warm in equal measure, the particular register of a woman who had learned that warmth and sharpness were not in opposition. Thank you for picking up, Claire said. I expected you'd call, Judith said. After the other night. Claire paused. You were watching. Everyone was watching, dear. Your ex-husband is not as subtle as he believes himself to be. A brief pause. He never was. I've known Daniel Whitmore for a long time, longer than he knows. Something moved in Claire's chest. How long? She said. Long enough, Judith said, to have questions about certain business dealings of his from about 8 years ago that I was never able to get satisfactory answers to. Another pause. I had attorneys look into it at the time. They found enough to make me refuse any partnership with him going forward, but not enough to act on formally. I assumed he'd simply, she paused, moved the relevant pieces somewhere less visible. Claire looked at Adrian across the counter. He was watching her face. Ms. Harmon, Claire said, I wonder if what you couldn't find 8 years ago has been found now. A silence on the line. Then Judith Harmon said, Tell me what you have. And the conversation that followed lasted 45 minutes, and by the end of it, 3 things had happened. Judith had agreed to review the documents. Judith had mentioned carefully that she was personally acquainted with 2 members of the regulatory body that would have oversight jurisdiction over the specific instruments in question. And Judith had said at the very end, in the same precise and warm voice with which she'd picked up the phone, Daniel Whitmore has been operating under the assumption that the people he dismissed weren't paying attention. He was wrong about that. He has been wrong about that for a very long time. Claire ended the call. She sat with it for a moment. Adrian said nothing. He was good at nothing. He gave it the space it needed. She's going to help, Claire said. Yes, he said. I could tell. This is becoming something larger than a divorce settlement dispute. It was always going to become that, he said. When a man has operated the way Daniel has for as long as he has, the things he did don't stay contained. There are other people in other rooms who know pieces. They were just waiting for someone to name it first. Claire looked at him. Is that what I'm doing, naming it? Yes, he said. And you're not doing it to destroy him. You're doing it because the truth exists, and it belongs on the record." She was quiet. "He called you collateral," she said. "He tried to. And you didn't do what he expected." She held his gaze. "He expected you to pull back, to protect your interests, to make the calculation that I wasn't worth the complication." Adrian held her gaze steadily. "You're not a complication," he said. "You're a person I choose to stand beside." She was still. 3 seconds. 4. Something in her face moved, that small, quiet dropping of guard that she did so rarely and with such care, and every time it happened, it caught him entirely off balance, because he had not been prepared a year ago for what it would feel like when someone trusted him that way. "He's going to go public," she said. "Soon. I know the timeline on how he operates. He'll have something out within the week." "Then we go first," Adrian said simply. "With what?" He looked at her. "With Judith Harmon on your side, and 11 documented instruments, and 22 years of Elaine Cho's experience, and the testimony of every person in that room who watched him perform that particular show the other night." He paused. "He built a story about you. We're going to put the real one on the record." She looked at him for a long moment. "And if he retaliates," she said, "against you specifically, if he has something, then I'll—" "If he retaliates," she said, "against you specifically, if he has something, then I'll handle it," Adrian said. "That's not your concern. It is my concern," she said, and her voice carried something firm and direct that she didn't bother to soften. "You are my concern. What happens to you is not separate from what I care about. So if he has something on you, I need to know." The directness of it landed in him somewhere that registered not as pressure, but as relief. The particular relief of someone who was not used to being looked after and had not known how much they needed it until it arrived. "There's nothing he has," Adrian said. He made a gesture. "He has no substance." He held her gaze. "I've been doing this a very long time, Claire. My affairs are clean." She looked at him. "Clean," she said. "Clean," he repeated. She considered the word. She considered him. And then quietly, without fanfare, with the matter-of-fact certainty of someone who had done the work of learning to trust their own judgment again, she nodded. "Okay," she said, and the word held everything she didn't add. 3 days later, Elaine filed the motion to reopen the divorce settlement. And the same afternoon, a carefully sourced article appeared in the financial press. Not about Claire, not about Adrian, but about a pattern of financial irregularities connected to several investment instruments from the early part of the decade. It did not name Daniel Whitmore. It did not need to. The people who needed to recognize the pattern did. Daniel's attorney called Elaine within the hour. He was no longer smooth. Elaine listened to everything he said, and when he finished, she said, "Your client should have thought more carefully about who was in the room." Price said, "Which room?" Elaine said, "All of them." And she ended the call. And across the city, in a penthouse that had become considerably less comfortable in the past week, Daniel Whitmore stood at his window and looked at the financial press article on his phone and understood for the first time with complete clarity that the woman he had spent 6 years systematically diminishing had not simply survived him. She had been building quietly and without announcement the exact coalition that was now assembled against him, and the man beside her was not her protector. He was her equal, and together they were a different kind of force than either of them would have been alone. The article ran on a Thursday. By Friday morning, Daniel's phone had logged 23 missed calls. Not from friends. Not from colleagues reaching out with concern or loyalty. From the kind of people who called when they needed to calculate their own exposure partners, investors, board members of companies where Daniel sat in an advisory capacity, men who had built comfortable professional relationships with him on the assumption that his particular brand of risk would never become their problem. That assumption was no longer comfortable. Daniel knew how to read a phone log the way other people read weather. 23 calls in 12 hours from 23 different numbers was not concern. It was distance. It was people beginning the quiet process of establishing for their own records that they had reached out and expressed reservations, that they had not been passive, That when the full shape of this became public, and it was going to become fully public, he understood that now in a way he had not entirely understood it before. Friday morning there would be documentation that they had asked questions. He sat with that phone log for a long time. Then he called Price. Price answered on the first ring, which was its own kind of information. Attorneys who were confident in your position let the phone ring twice. They answered on the first ring when they needed to manage you. "Tell me where we are," Daniel said. "Elaine Cho's filing is solid," Price said. "I've had 2 of my people go through it overnight. The motion to reopen is going to be granted. I won't tell you otherwise because there's no version of that outcome I can honestly argue against right now. That's not what I asked." "I know what you asked." Price's voice was careful. "Where we are is this: the settlement dispute is now the least of your concerns. The financial press piece has been picked up by 2 other outlets as of this morning. Neither piece names you directly, but both describe a pattern that anyone in your professional network will recognize." Daniel was quiet. "And the regulatory question," he said. "The instruments. Elaine identified 3 of them involve lenders with mandatory reporting requirements. If those lenders have been presented with this documentation, which I have to assume they have been or will be shortly, they don't have a choice about reporting. That process will be independent of anything Claire Morgan decides to pursue personally." Daniel's jaw tightened. He had known this was a possibility. He had run the scenario in his head the night he opened the envelope standing in his kitchen, refusing to let his hands shake. He had known from the moment he saw the depth of what Adrian's people had compiled that the regulatory exposure was real. He had spent 3 years believing those instruments were buried deep enough that even a dedicated search would come up empty. He had been wrong. "What are my options?" he said. Price was quiet for a moment longer than Daniel liked. "There's a version of this," Price said carefully, "where you get ahead of it. Where you approach the settlement renegotiation not as a contested dispute, but as a correction. Where you acknowledge that the financial accounting during the marriage was imprecise and agree to terms that reflect the actual picture." Daniel said nothing. "The advantage of that path," Price continued, "is that it limits the narrative. It becomes a private legal settlement rather than a public proceeding. It keeps the regulatory reporting limited to what's already visible rather than opening discovery into the full scope." "And the disadvantage," Daniel said. "The disadvantage is that it concedes the central point. It confirms that Claire's version of events is accurate." "I'm not conceding that." "Daniel." Price's voice dropped a register. It was the first time in 7 years of professional relationship that Price had used that particular tone with him. The tone that said the performance was over and they were speaking plainly now. "I have been in this business for 30 years. I have seen cases with less documentation than what Elaine Cho has assembled result in federal referrals. I am telling you clearly as your attorney that fighting this in its current form is not a strategy. It is an expense. It is a very large expense that ends in the same place, except that the place it ends is a public record rather than a private one." Silence. Daniel stood at his window. He had stood at this window 100 times in the last 3 years and looked out at the city and told himself a story about where he was and where Claire was and what the distance between those 2 positions proved about who had been right. He had told himself that story so many times it had become something close to true inside him. And now, Price was telling him in the flat professional language of a man who had nothing to gain from honesty except his own conscience, that the story was not going to survive contact with a courtroom. "Give me 24 hours, Daniel said. "I can give you that," Price said. "But I'd use it carefully." Claire did not know about Price's call until Adrian told her over the phone that afternoon, having received a brief account from Elaine, who had received it from a contact in Price's firm, the kind of secondary network that people like Adrian maintained, not through intimidation, but through the slow accumulation of being someone whose discretion could be trusted. She was at her desk when he called. She had been looking at a contract renewal that needed her attention and finding it impossible to focus on anything except the particular suspended feeling of waiting. Waiting for Daniel's next move. Waiting for the regulatory response. Waiting for the moment when the shape of what was happening became fully defined, rather than hovering at the edges of definition. He's considering the settlement path, Adrian said. Price is pushing him toward it. Claire absorbed this. He won't take it, she said. Elaine thinks he might. I know him better than Elaine does. She set the contract aside. He'll spend the 24 hours looking for a different angle, something to negotiate with. Something that changes the leverage dynamic enough that he can agree to terms without feeling like he lost. She paused. He can't do the thing that's right for him if it looks like losing. That's how he's built. Then what does he need to make it look like? She thought about it. He needs to believe he chose it. He chose it, she said. Not that it was forced on him. If he can frame the settlement internally as a decision he made rather than a defeat, he accepted he might be able to get there. She paused again. But someone would have to give him that framing, someone he respects. Adrian was quiet for a moment. Not you, he said. No, never me. He would never accept anything from me that didn't feel like victory for him. She thought. And not you directly. Anything coming from your direction is a threat to him, even when it isn't. Judith Harmon, Adrian said. Claire stilled. She had been thinking it half a second before he said it, and the simultaneousness of it, the way they had arrived at the same answer, through the same reasoning, at the same moment, registered in her chest as something warm and slightly startling. Judith Harmon, she confirmed. He respects her. He doesn't like her. He said things about her that make it very clear he underestimates her. But he respects what she represents in this city. And she has no personal stake in this that he can weaponize. She's not connected to him professionally in any way that gives him leverage. She also, Adrian said, genuinely despises what he did. Yes. Claire's voice was quiet. She does. I'll ask her, Adrian said. She may say no. She may, he agreed. But she answered on the second ring when you called her. I don't think she's indifferent to how this ends. Judith Harmon did not say no. She said, I've been waiting for someone to ask me to do something useful for the past 3 days. What do you need? Adrian explained. Judith listened without interrupting, a quality Claire had noted, and that Adrian confirmed was even more pronounced in person. She processed while listening, rather than formulating her response, while the other person was still talking, which was rarer than it should have been among people at her level. You want me to give him a door, Judith said. We want him to see one that exists, Adrian said. Whether he walks through it is his decision. If I reach out to Daniel Whitmore, he will assume it's a play, Judith said. He will spend the first 20 minutes of any conversation trying to figure out what I want from it. Yes, Adrian said. And when he can't figure it out, then he'll listen. A pause. He's not a stupid man, Judith said. It was not a defense of Daniel. It was an operational assessment. He's calculated and self-serving, and he made choices that are genuinely indefensible. But he is not stupid. He will know when I call that the call is not random. We're not trying to trick him, Adrian said. We're giving him an opportunity to do the right thing in a way that lets him retain a fragment of dignity, which is more than what he gave Claire. A longer pause. No, Judith said. It is considerably more, which is also why it might work. She was quiet for one more moment. I'll call him this afternoon. The conversation between Judith Harmon and Daniel Whitmore lasted 31 minutes. Judith did not record it. She did not need to. She had spent 30 years in rooms where the important thing was not what was said, but what shifted, and she was very good at tracking shifts. She called Adrian afterward and gave him a precise account. She had reached out on the pretext of a board introduction. She owed him a thin pretext, and Daniel had known it was thin within the first 3 minutes, which was exactly what she had intended. She had then spent 4 minutes asking him about his current advisory work, which she did not care about, while he decided whether to call her on the pretext or play along. He played along. And then she had said, with the particular directness that had made her who she was in this city, Daniel, I was at the gala. A pause on his end. I know, he said. I've also seen the filing. She paused. And I've known Elaine Cho for 15 years. I know what it means when Elaine Cho files something. Another pause. Longer. What do you want, Judith? He said. I want you to understand something, she said. Not as a threat. As someone who has watched this city for 30 years and watched what happens to people who fight the wrong battles. She paused. Claire Morgan is not going away. The documentation is not going away. The people who watched what you did at that gala are not going away. And the regulatory clock started the moment those lenders were notified, which was 3 days ago. Silence from Daniel. The only variable that remains in your control, Judith continued, is what this looks like when it's finished. Right now, you have a choice about that. In 6 months, you won't. Daniel said, and if I agree to the settlement? Then it becomes a legal correction. It becomes a private matter. The documentation doesn't disappear, but the story becomes about a financial accounting dispute that was resolved rather than a fraud that was adjudicated. People will still know. Some people will always know, Judith said. The question is what they know officially. What goes on the record? What follows your name in every search and every background check for the rest of your professional life? She paused. I am telling you plainly, Daniel. Take the door. Not for Claire's sake. For yours. A very long silence. She sent you, he said. No one sent me, Judith said. I am calling you because I have watched 3 people in this city in the past decade destroy themselves by choosing the fight over the outcome, and I did not find it instructive or satisfying to watch. I find it wasteful. Her voice held no warmth toward him specifically, but no cruelty either. It held the particular clarity of someone who has moved past the point where she needed to perform either. This is a door. It is open right now. Make the choice. She told Adrian. He said he needed to think about it. Adrian said, that's yes. Judith was quiet for a moment. Yes. That's yes. Claire was at Adrian's apartment when he relayed the account of Judith's call. She sat with it for a moment. He's going to agree, she said. I think so. She got up. She walked to the window, not to look at anything specific, but because she needed to move because she had been sitting still with this for days, and something in her body needed the recognition that things were actually changing. I thought I'd feel more, she said. When this moment got close, I thought there'd be more I don't know. Relief, vindication, something louder than this. What do you feel? Adrian said. She turned from the window. Tired, she said. And then underneath the tired something solid, like ground that's actually there. She held his gaze. Do you know what I mean? Yes, he said. I know exactly what you mean. I spent 3 years on ground that moved under me every time I put weight on it. Everything I thought was stable turned out to have Daniel somewhere underneath it shifting things. She paused. And now, there's just the actual ground. Solid, real, mine. She came back and sat down. What happens after the settlement, she said. It depends on the regulatory process. Elaine says, no, Claire said. I know what Elaine says. I've talked to Elaine. I mean what happens after, for you. She held his gaze directly. You have been in the middle of this for months. You carried the file. You managed Elaine and Judith and Price's implied threats, and your own business interests intersecting with all of this. What happens to you? He was quiet for a moment. She watched him, this man who had walked through every piece of this with the quiet, precise competence of someone who had learned that capability was not the same as control, that the most powerful thing he could do for the person beside him was to be present without taking over. She watched him, and she thought about all the moments across the past year where she had expected him to overstep, and he hadn't. Where she had braced for the particular kind of help that came with conditions, and it had arrived without any. I go back to my work, he said finally, which has been somewhat neglected. She almost smiled. I know. Marcus called me on Tuesday. Adrian looked at her. Marcus called you. He wanted to know if you were going to be available for a meeting you'd postponed twice. She held his gaze. He was very professional about it. He did not say anything about you being distracted, but I could hear it. Marcus is discreet. Marcus is worried about you, she said, which tells me something about the kind of person you are, that the man who runs your finances for 11 years is willing to make an unusual phone call on your behalf. She paused. I called him back. I told him you'd be available next week. Adrian looked at her for a long moment. "You managed my schedule," he said. "One meeting," she said. "Don't get used to it." Something moved in his face, that rare thing, the unguarded expression he almost never let reach the surface. "I should go back to the work," he said. "But I want you to know this." He gestured a small motion that somehow encompassed everything. "Being in the middle of this with you, it hasn't been a burden. In case you've been carrying that." She had been carrying that. She hadn't known she had been carrying it until he named it. "I didn't want you to feel obligated," she said quietly, "to any of this. To Elaine's fees or Judith's involvement, or I didn't want it to become something you felt you'd started and couldn't walk away from." "I didn't feel any of that," he said. "How do I know?" He held her gaze steadily. "Because I have walked away from things my entire professional life when they stopped being worth the cost," he said. "I am very good at that calculation. I have made it 100 times, and I have not made it once in the direction of this of you, because the calculation comes out the same way every time I run it." He paused. "You are worth it, without question, every time." She held that. 3 seconds. 5. "You are the most direct person I have ever met," she said. "And that should not surprise me given who you are, but it still surprises me." "Does it bother you?" "No," she said. "It terrifies me a little, because I don't know what to do with someone who just says the true thing without making me work for it." "You get used to it," he said. "Do I?" She looked at him carefully. "Because I spent 6 years being trained to work for every honest thing, to earn every real answer, to never quite be sure what was true because the truth was always available for revision if it became inconvenient." She paused. "That kind of training doesn't just stop." "I know," he said. "I'm not asking you to perform certainty you don't have." He held her gaze. "I'm asking you to let the evidence accumulate." She looked at him. "The evidence," she said. "Every conversation, every decision I've made when you weren't watching, everything Marcus can tell you about how I've operated when it wasn't your case on my desk." He paused. "Let it accumulate. Don't force a conclusion. Just stay in the room long enough to see what's actually there." She was quiet for a long moment. "I'm not going anywhere," she said finally. It was quiet. It was not dramatic. It was not a declaration that filled the room with weight. It was just a simple, direct statement from a woman who had finally stopped apologizing for the space she occupied and started simply telling the truth about where she intended to be. And that, for Adrian Valenti, was everything. Elaine called 3 days later. Daniel had signed. Not under duress, or at least not under duress that could be named or documented. He had signed because Price had sat across from him and laid out the numbers in a language that even Daniel's ego could not argue with. He had signed because Judith's call had done exactly what a 30-year professional reputation could do in 60 seconds of frank conversation. He had signed because the regulatory clock was running whether he agreed to anything or not, and at least this way, he retained some control over the story. He had signed, and it was done. And the original settlement was voided, and the new terms reflected the actual financial picture of the marriage, which meant that Claire received the correction of 3 years of fraudulent accounting documented and court-approved, alongside a financial settlement that bore no resemblance to what she had accepted the first time around, when she had signed papers with no idea what they actually said about a reality that had been engineered without her knowledge. Elaine had called Claire first. Claire had listened to the whole thing and then said, "Thank you, Elaine." And Elaine, 22 years in financial law, who had delivered news of this kind in every register from catastrophic to triumphant, had said, "You're welcome. It was the right outcome. I don't always get to work on cases where that's unambiguous. This one was." Claire had called Adrian immediately after. "It's done," she said. "I know," he said. "Elaine called me." "She called you first." "She called us simultaneously," he said. "I think she had 2 phones." Claire laughed. It was the first real laugh, the unguarded kind, not performed or polite, that she had managed in 2 weeks. It came out a little rough because it had been waiting that long. "It's done," she said again. Differently this time, not reporting it, feeling it. "Yes," he said. She sat with it. The solid ground. Real. Unmoving. Hers. I need to do something, she said. Not celebrate, I don't want to celebrate, but something that's not just sitting with this. She paused. Can we just go somewhere and walk, just the two of us? No phones, no Elaine, no Marcus, just walk. A brief silence. Yes, he said. Where do you want to go? I don't care, she said. Anywhere that's not connected to any of this. Somewhere that's just ordinary, normal, where we're just two people walking. Give me 20 minutes, he said. She smiled. 20 minutes, she said. And she put the phone down and sat for a moment in the quiet of her office, in the silence that was no longer the silence of waiting for the next thing to collapse, and she let it reach her. The fact of it, the reality of it, the ground under her feet that was simply there. The voice in her head that had sounded like Daniel for 3 years was not silent. She did not expect it to be silent. She had read enough and lived enough to understand that the retraining of a mind did not happen in a single legal filing, or a single phone call, or a single moment of vindication. But it was quieter. And under it, clearer than it had been in a very long time, was her own voice. And her own voice was saying, "You did this. Not alone." She was done pretending that independence meant refusing help from people who offered it honestly. But the courage it had taken to stand in that ballroom without flinching. The courage to call Judith Harmon and say, "I wonder if what you couldn't find has been found now." The courage to stay in the room long enough to let the evidence of what was real accumulate rather than running from it, because the last time she'd trusted it, it had been manufactured. That courage was hers, and Daniel Whitmore signing papers. 3 days after a phone call, he'd never fully understood, had not been able to take it, had not been able to diminish it, had stood in front of a room full of witnesses and aimed every weapon he had at the version of her he'd built in his memory, and found that the version of her he'd built in his memory no longer existed. She had become someone he no longer knew how to dismantle, and the man beside her had never needed her to be anything other than exactly that. She picked up her bag. She turned off her desk lamp, and she walked out of her office into an ordinary Thursday afternoon, 20 minutes from a walk with Adrian Valenti, and the ground was solid under every single step. The walk lasted 2 hours. They did not talk about Daniel. They did not talk about Elaine, or the settlement, or the regulatory process that was now running on its own momentum, separate from anything either of them needed to manage. They walked and they talked about other things, small things, real things. The kind of conversation that had no agenda and no strategy and no undercurrent of anything except two people being present with each other in an ordinary afternoon. Adrian talked about a building his grandfather had owned in a neighborhood that no longer looked anything like the neighborhood his grandfather had known, and how he had driven past it 3 weeks ago and stood on the sidewalk for 10 minutes trying to find something recognizable. Claire talked about the first business she had tried to start before Daniel. Before any of it, a small consulting practice. She'd run out of a spare bedroom for 14 months before concluding it wasn't working, which she now understood with the perspective of a decade had actually been working fine. She had simply been 28 and terrified, and had not yet learned the difference between a business that needed more time and a business that needed to be abandoned. Adrian listened to that without offering a reframe or a silver lining, or any of the reflexive optimism that people deployed when someone described a past failure. He just listened. And then he said, "What would you tell yourself now if you could go back to that spare bedroom?" She thought about it seriously. "That scared is not the same as wrong," she said. "That doing something frightening and doing something mistaken are not the same category. I conflated them for years." She paused. "I think that's what Daniel exploited, actually. That conflation. He found the place where I couldn't distinguish between fear and failure, and he lived there." Adrian looked at her as they walked. "Not anymore," he said. "No," she agreed. "Not anymore." They walked a little further, and then Claire said, without planning to, without it being a statement she had constructed or rehearsed, "I love you." She heard herself say it, and felt the particular surprised stillness of someone who has discovered what they actually think by hearing themselves say it out loud. Adrian stopped walking. She stopped too. She looked at him, and for 1 second, just one, she felt the old reflex, the one that had been trained into her over 6 years of loving someone who weaponized vulnerability. The reflex that said, take it back. Manage it. Protect yourself from what happens next. She did not take it back. She had promised herself quietly, privately, in the months since the ground had started becoming solid again, that she was done taking things back. Adrian looked at her. I know, he said. She blinked. That's not, she started. I know, he said again. Because I feel it too. I have felt it for months. I was waiting for you to get there in your own time because anything else would have been pressure and you'd had enough of that. He held her gaze. I love you, Claire. I have loved you since the night you disagreed with me twice in 5 minutes and didn't apologize for either. She stared at him. That was 14 months ago, she said. Yes. You've been in love with me for 14 months and you didn't say anything. You needed the time, he said simply. And I had it to give. She looked at him for a long, quiet moment. That is, she said finally, the most patient thing anyone has ever done for me. It wasn't patience, he said. It was certainty. Patient implies waiting for something you're not sure about. I was certain. I was just giving you room to arrive. She stood there with that, with the fact of it. With the 14 months of him being certain while she was still learning to trust her own ground. With the awareness that this man had carried a truth about his own feelings, with the same careful, unhurried discretion with which he had carried the truth in that file, not using it, not leveraging it, simply holding it until the moment it could land properly. I don't know what to do with you, she said. Yes, you do, he said. And she laughed that real laugh again, the unguarded one, and they kept walking. The regulatory process concluded 11 weeks later. It was not dramatic. Real legal and regulatory proceedings. Rarely, where they happened in offices and written submissions in the language of institutional process that was designed to be precise rather than narrative. But the outcome was documented and official and permanent, and that was what Claire had asked for. 2 of the 3 lenders filed mandatory reports. One of them, a mid-sized institutional firm whose compliance department had apparently been waiting for exactly this kind of external trigger to pursue something they had flagged internally 2 years earlier, went further than required. Their submission detailed a pattern that extended beyond the instruments connected to Claire's marriage and touched 3 other transactions in Daniel's history that had previously been too isolated to contextualize. Elaine called Claire when that submission landed. You should know, Elaine said, that what happened here is larger than what you set out to do. Claire took a moment with that. Is that good or bad? It's true, Elaine said. Which is the category that matters. She paused. The correction to your settlement is finalized. Your name is clean on every instrument. The record reflects what actually happened. Another pause. And Daniel Whitmore's professional network has been contracting for the past 6 weeks, in the way that networks contract when people decide someone is a liability rather than an asset. I didn't do that, Claire said. I didn't go after his network. No, Elaine said. The truth did that. You just made the truth available. Claire sat with that distinction for a moment. She thought about the version of herself 3 years ago, the woman who had walked out of the marriage with a settlement she hadn't understood. Signing papers she'd accepted because she was exhausted, and her confidence had been so systematically dismantled that she couldn't trust her own read of what was fair. That woman had not believed in any part of herself that had access to belief that the truth was on her side. She had accepted a version of events in which she was the variable that hadn't worked, the investment that hadn't performed, the person who simply hadn't been enough. That woman had needed 3 years and a lot of work to get to the point of standing in a ballroom without flinching. And then the flinching had gone away, and the ground had become solid. And the truth which had always existed, which had been there in the financial records, and the documents, and the 11 instruments, and the 4 months before the wedding, had simply needed someone to assemble it and put it where it could be seen. Thank you, Elaine, Claire said, for everything. Thank me by building something worth defending next time, Elaine said. Which you were already doing. Keep doing it. Judith Harmon invited Claire to lunch 3 weeks after the regulatory conclusion, not as a professional courtesy. As herself, the way Judith did things when she had decided someone was worth knowing in the category of actual human beings rather than useful professional contacts. She made that distinction clearly and early in relationships, and she had apparently made it about Claire sometime between the second ring of the phone and the end of the 45-minute conversation. They met at a restaurant. Judith chose that was quiet on weekday afternoons and served food that was good without performing its own goodness, which Judith said was her primary criterion for any room she spent time in. They talked for 3 hours. Judith talked about the first board that had told her she was too young to run what her father had built, and the specific quality of the anger she had felt, which she described not as hot, but as clarifying the kind that burned off everything irrelevant and left only the question of what she was going to do next. Claire talked about the list she had made. The actual handwritten list of failures she had attributed to herself that she now understood were not hers. She had torn it up 6 weeks earlier slowly and deliberately, and then she had written a new list, not of failures, but of decisions she had made independently without Daniel's influence that had worked. Things she had built, and choices she had made, and moments where her own instinct had been right when she'd trusted it. The new list was longer than the old one. She hadn't expected that. "You wouldn't have expected it," Judith said, "because the narrative you were living under was designed to make your successes look derivative and your failures look definitive. Reversing that takes time." She looked at Claire directly. "How are you now, honestly?" Claire considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. "Honest answer," she said. "Some days I still hear his voice, the internal version of it, the one that asks whether I actually earned something or just got lucky, or whether the people who trust me would trust me if they knew everything." She paused. "But I'm learning to respond to it rather than just absorbing it. To ask it back, what's the evidence? And the evidence is usually not what the voice claims." Judith looked at her. "That's not recovery," she said. "That's wisdom. There's a difference." Claire looked at her. "Which is, recovery is getting back to who you were," Judith said. "Wisdom is becoming someone the old version of you couldn't have been." She paused. "You are not the woman you were before Daniel. You are someone considerably more formidable. He did not create that you did from the material he gave you to work with. But you would not be this specific version of yourself without having gone through it." She held Claire's gaze. "That does not mean it was worth it. It was not worth it. He had no right to do what he did. But you are here, and here is not nothing." Claire held that. She thought about it for the rest of the day. Here is not nothing. It was the truest thing anyone had said to her in a long time. The Valenti Foundation Gala came around again 8 months after the first one. Same ballroom, same annual event, same roster of the powerful and the influential and the men and women who moved the city from layers that most people never saw clearly. Claire wore red this time, not because she was making a statement. She was past the age of dressing for statements, but because she had stood in front of her closet the morning of the event and reached for the navy dress. The safe one, the one her assistant would have called elegant and understated, and she had put it back. She had reached for the red one instead, the one she had bought 3 months ago, and worn exactly nowhere, because she had not yet found the occasion that felt like enough. This felt like enough. Priya, who had been with her long enough to have watched the entire arc of the past 8 months, saw her come out of the elevator and said without preamble, "That's the one." Claire smiled. "Don't make it a thing." "It's already a thing," Priya said, and handed her the evening's briefing folder with the expression of someone who had absolutely made it a thing and was not apologizing. Adrian was waiting in the lobby. He looked at her when she came through the door, and his expression did the thing it occasionally did when he wasn't monitoring it. The brief, unguarded thing gone almost before it was visible. He was good at composure. She had gotten very good at catching the moments when it wasn't entirely there. "Red," he said. "Red," she confirmed. He offered his arm. She took it, and they walked into the ballroom together. The first thing she noticed was how many people she knew, not in the way she had known people at the last gala. the careful professional knowledge of names and positions, and the correct way to navigate each conversation. She knew these people the way you know people after 8 months of being yourself around them. After board meetings and charity committees and the professional relationships that had quietly deepened once the story about who Claire Morgan was got corrected at its source. Judith Harmon was across the room. She saw Claire and raised her glass in the smallest possible gesture, the kind that said, "I see you, and I am not making a production of it." Claire raised hers back. Marcus, who had come at Adrian's invitation, and who turned out to be a compact, precise man in his mid-50s, who looked exactly like someone who ran financial intelligence for 11 years, introduced himself to Claire properly for the first time. He shook her hand and said, "I understand you organized one of Adrian's meetings." "One," she said. "He was more focused the following week than he had been in 2 months," Marcus said. "I'm considering making it a standing arrangement." She laughed. Adrian beside her said nothing, but had the expression of a man who was outnumbered and had decided the most dignified response was patience. The evening moved, the way evenings moved when you were no longer braced against them. Fast in some places, unhurried in others. A conversation with a city councilwoman that turned into a genuine exchange about infrastructure and community investment and lasted 40 minutes before either of them checked the time. A brief warm interaction with a couple who had known Adrian for years and who received Claire with the particular naturalness that told her she had been spoken of in their presence before and spoken of well. She did not look for Daniel. That was the thing she noticed. She did not scan the room for him. She had done it at the last gala reflexively, the way you tracked a thing you were afraid of. She was not doing it now. Not because she was performing courage, but because the actual need to track him had left her somewhere in the past 8 months and she hadn't noticed it go. He was not there. She learned this, not from looking, but from a brief mention by someone who had worked with him peripherally and noted without particular weight that Daniel had stepped back from several public events in recent months. The professional contraction that Elaine had described was visible to people who paid attention to those things. And in rooms like this one, most people paid attention to those things. Claire registered it and moved on. She did not feel vindicated. She did not feel sorry. She felt something closer to neutral, the particular neutrality that was not indifference, but completion. The feeling that a chapter had ended and the ending was final, and she did not need to revisit it. She was in the next chapter now, an hour into the evening. She found herself standing alone for a moment. Adrian had been pulled into a conversation with 2 people she recognized as significant to one of his business interests, and she had released his arm with the easy naturalness of 2 people who were comfortable enough with each other that separation at a social event required no negotiation. She stood with her champagne. She looked at the room, and something moved through her that she took a moment to name, because it was not a familiar feeling, and she wanted to name it accurately. It was belonging. Not the performed kind, not the careful navigation of a space where she was aware always of being evaluated. Not the borrowed belonging of being attached to someone powerful enough that his presence created a clearing around her that she could stand in. Just belonging. She was in this room because she had built something real, because she had survived something that had been designed to prevent her from building anything, and had built it anyway. Because the people who knew her in this room knew her as Claire Morgan, the company she had grown, the decisions she had made, the woman who had stood in this same ballroom 8 months ago and refused to flinch when someone aimed everything they had at her. They knew her, not the version Daniel had circulated, not the version she had half believed during the bad years. The actual version, the one who had always been there waiting for the space to be visible. Judith appeared at her elbow. "You look like someone who just understood something," Judith said. "I think I did," Claire said. "Tell me." Claire looked at the room. "I spent years feeling like I was in spaces I hadn't earned, like I was there because of someone else's invitation, and if that invitation was revoked, the space would close." She paused. "I don't feel that right now." Judith was quiet for a moment. "Do you know when that changes?" she said. "I remember the exact event. I was 41. I had been running the firm for 9 years. Someone at a dinner, a man I won't name because he genuinely isn't worth naming, made a comment about my father's legacy. implying I was maintaining rather than building. She paused. And I looked at him, and I thought you are wrong. And I knew I was right. Not hoped. Knew. She looked at Claire. That's when it changed. The moment I stopped needing them to agree with my assessment and just knew. Claire held that. That's where I am, she said quietly. Yes, Judith said. I could see that from across the room. Adrian reappeared at her side. He looked between them. Should I be concerned about what I just missed? No, Judith said. We were just talking about knowing things. Knowing things, he repeated. The specific kind, Judith said. That doesn't require outside confirmation. She looked at him with the direct, undecorated gaze she turned on most things. You chose well, she said. It was not addressed to Claire. It was addressed to Adrian. He looked at Claire. Yes, he said. I know. Judith smiled briefly genuinely and moved back into the room. Later in the evening, a woman approached Claire. She was in her late 30s, and she had the particular quality of someone who had been working up to a conversation for the past 40 minutes and had finally decided to have it. She introduced herself as Rachel. She mentioned a professional connection. She worked at the edge of an industry that overlapped with Claire's, and then she said with the directness of someone who had run out of oblique ways to get to the point, I was here, last year, at this event. Claire looked at her. I saw what happened, Rachel said. With your ex-husband. She paused. I've been wanting to say something ever since. I just didn't have a context for saying it until tonight. What did you want to say? Claire said. Rachel looked at her carefully. I'm in something similar. Not exactly the same. It's not I don't know if it's as constructed as what I saw described in the press. But the feeling. The way you described it, the voice, the ground moving. She paused. I recognized it. Claire was still. She looked at this woman, this stranger, who had been in the room 8 months ago and had watched the whole thing and had been carrying something ever since that had brought her across a ballroom tonight to say it. How long? Claire said. 4 years, Rachel said. Married. I keep thinking I'm being dramatic. I keep thinking it's not bad enough to do anything about. That there's no document, no evidence. It's just the way the ground moves, Claire said. Rachel looked at her. Yes. Claire held her gaze. It's enough, she said. You don't need a file. You don't need 11 documented instruments. The way the ground moves is enough. She paused. The voice that sounds like him, even when he's not in the room, that's enough. That's real. That's not dramatic. Rachel was quiet. I don't know what to do, she said. I know, Claire said. I know exactly what that feels like. And I'm not going to stand here and tell you it's simple because it isn't. She reached into her evening bag and found a card, her personal card, not the professional one, and held it out. But I found out that there are people who know how to help. And I found out that you don't have to carry the whole weight of figuring it out before you start. Rachel took the card. She looked at it. Thank you, she said. Her voice was careful in the way voices got when something was being held with great concentration. I've been watching you tonight. The way you're here. The way you're just in the room. I kept thinking, is that something you learn, or is it something you get back? Claire considered the question with everything she had. Both, she said finally. You learn it, and you get it back at the same time. Because the version of you that could do it was always there. It just needed the space. She paused. Take up the space. That's where it starts. Rachel nodded. She moved back into the room. Claire watched her go. Adrian had been near enough to observe without being close enough to intrude. He came to stand beside her. Who was that? He said. Someone who needed to see that it was possible, Claire said. He looked at her. You just became someone's proof of concept, he said. She thought about that. Is that what happened? She said. Yes, he said. That's exactly what happened. She was quiet for a moment. Good, she said. The evening ended, the way evenings ended, when you were no longer performing your way through them naturally, at a pace that felt right, without the countdown to the graceful exit. In the car on the way home, They were quiet for a while. The good kind of quiet. The kind that required nothing from either of them. Then Adrian said, "There's something I want to ask you." She looked at him. His voice had a quality she didn't hear often, not uncertain exactly, but careful. Deliberate. The voice of someone who had thought about something for a long time, and was now saying it in real time, for the first time. "When all of this started," he said. "The gala. Daniel. The file. All of it. You asked me once what I would do if you decided you didn't want to pursue any of it. If you decided you wanted to close the file and move on." "I remember," she said. "I told you it was your choice, that the truth was yours and the decision was yours." "You did." "I meant that," he said. "I want you to know I still mean it. Whatever shape your life takes from here, the company, this city, what you want your days to look like, that's yours. I'm not building a structure around you. I'm not putting infrastructure in place and calling it love." She looked at him in the dark of the car. "I know," she said. "I need you to actually know it," he said. "Not take it on faith. Know it." "Adrian." Her voice was quiet and certain. "I know it because of how you've operated for the past 14 months. Not because of what you've said. Because of what you haven't done." She paused. "You haven't told me what to decide. You haven't moved a piece on the board without asking me first. You haven't once made me feel like I was being managed." She held his gaze. "That's not something you perform. That's something you are." He was quiet. "I want to build something with you," she said. "Not because I need someone beside me. I've proven to myself, at least, that I don't need that. But because building it with you makes it something different, something better." She paused. "You make me think more clearly. You make me braver. Not because you're brave for me, because watching someone operate from that kind of steadiness teaches you that it's available, that it's not just something other people have." Adrian looked at her. "I want to build it with you too," he said. "No performance, no flourish. Just the truth said plainly by a man who had spent his life in rooms where nothing was ever simply itself, where every statement carried a second meaning, and every offer concealed a calculation, and who had found in the past 14 months that the most powerful thing he had ever done was simply tell the truth to someone who would believe it." She reached over and put her hand in his. He held it, and the city moved past the windows. 3 months later, Claire stood in front of her company's full team, 23 people, some of whom had been with her from the first year when the company had 4 employees and a rented desk, and she announced the expansion she had been planning for 8 months. A new division. 3 new cities. A partnership with Judith Harmon's firm that had been in quiet negotiation for the past 6 weeks and had closed the previous afternoon. The room responded the way rooms responded when people who had believed in something saw it becoming more than they had dared to plan for. Claire looked at the faces of the people who had stayed when she hadn't given them a reason to stay, who had bet on something they couldn't entirely see, because they trusted her enough to work in its direction. She thought about the list. The old one. The list of failures. The careful inventory of inadequacy she had maintained for 3 years and consulted in her lowest moments, like a document that proved something definitive about her. She thought about what was on it. All the things she now understood had not been hers. And she thought about the new list, which kept getting longer. After the meeting, Priya fell into step beside her. "The Harmon Partnership," Priya said. "That's bigger than I thought it was going to be." "Yes," Claire said. "The terms are..." "Good," Claire said. "The terms are genuinely good. Not good for us because we needed the deal good. Good because we're both bringing something the other doesn't have, and we negotiated it like that." Priya looked at her with the expression she had developed over 2 years of working for Claire, the one that was professional appreciation, with something warmer underneath it, that she kept mostly contained because she was very good at her job and very good at appropriate boundaries. "You seem different," Priya said. "Since the gala, the first one." "I am different," Claire said. "Better different or just different?" Claire thought about it. "More like myself," she said. "That's the best way I can put it. More like the version of myself I always had access to, but kept not choosing for reasons I now understand." She paused. "Better is relative. More like myself is just true. Priya nodded. She handed Claire the afternoon's meeting list and went back to her desk, and Claire stood in the corridor for a moment before the next thing started. She thought about Rachel, the woman from the gala with the card in her bag. Rachel had called 6 weeks after the gala on a Tuesday afternoon, and the conversation had lasted an hour. Claire did not know what Rachel had done after that call, or where she was now, or how it had gone. She had not heard back. She held that the not knowing without the need to resolve it. She had put something into the world. Whether it landed was not entirely in her control. She thought about Daniel. Not often. Less and less. But honestly, when she did, which is what you owed yourself, she had decided. The honest version. Not the version designed to make you feel like you had arrived somewhere clean. What she thought about Daniel was complicated and human, and she did not try to make it simple. She did not forgive him because she felt morally required to. She was working towards something that was adjacent to forgiveness, not because it was good for him, but because holding it was getting heavier than it was worth, and she had put down enough weight in the past year to know what it felt like when something no longer needed to be carried. She thought about Adrian. That was not complicated. That was just true. The way things were true, that you had done the work of verifying and found to be exactly what they presented as. No secondary meaning. No concealed calculation. Just a man who loved her in the specific, unhurried way that the best things were built without rushing the foundation, without decorating the structure before the ground was solid, without once asking her to be smaller so he could feel larger. The ground was solid now. She had checked it, repeatedly. The way you checked something you had learned the hard way could be manufactured. She had looked for the places where it moved, where it shifted under pressure, where the truth turned out to be constructed rather than real. She had not found them. The ground was solid because it was actually solid. And Claire Morgan, standing in the corridor of the company she had built from nothing in the city she had refused to leave, wearing the specific life she had refused to let anyone take from her, was exactly who she had always been. The woman Daniel Whitmore had tried to make disappear. The woman who had looked at everything he had done to her and chosen deliberately to build something he could never touch. She had not done it to prove anything to him. She had done it because she was the kind of woman who built things. And nothing he had said or signed or engineered or taken